Hi everyone, a little bit of a different video today, something that you have been asking me to do. This week my short story collection, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night, came out in paperback. Look at it, so beautiful. And I will leave details in the description box if you would like to get your hands on a copy. I put my everything into this book. If you would like to purchase it, that would be amazing. Lots of you have been asking me to talk about how I write, how I think about characters and structure and imagery and all of that stuff. So what I want to do today is to talk you through one of the stories in The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night. It's one that's being published on the Pool, so it's available to read online, so you can read it before I talk about it, and I'll leave the link in the description box down below. This is not me saying that you should be reading the story in this particular way. I don't want to be prescriptive at all. Once a book is out in the world, I firmly believe it belongs to the readers and all interpretations are valid so long as you can back it up with the text. This is going to be a video simply talking you through my own creative process and the thoughts that I had while I was writing it. So, the story in question is called Plum Pie, Zombie Green, Yellow Bee, Purple Monster, and as I said, it's published over at the Pool separately and is also inside The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night. So it's linked at the top of the description box down below. What you might want to do is go over there, grab yourself a cup of tea, have a read of the story, pause this video, and then come back to the video once you've read it. You can continue listening to what I'm saying if you want, but for added context, it's probably best that you read the story first. So go ahead and read, and I'll see you in a minute. Welcome back. I have printed off the story and I have scribbled notes all over it. I'm going to talk you through paragraph by paragraph. I'm going to come back to the title last of all because titles are always the last thing that I do. Titles set the scene and the tone for a reader, and generally speaking I don't think you can know what scene or tone you want to set until you've seen the whole piece. And before I start going through paragraph by paragraph, I'll start off by saying that when I first was writing this story, the image that I had was of someone who was part plant, part human, and I thought it would be an interesting thing to explore regarding themes of bodily difference. So using this plant metaphor to stand in for bodily difference. Now I will say that I think in general in the book world we need both real representations of bodily difference and disability, and also I think it is interesting to explore magical elements that are metaphors for those things, but we do need the real aspects too. Very important to have actual representation, and in the short story collection as a whole I have elements of both real physical differences and also magical realism elements that play with that idea as well. If you've been around my channel for a while, you know that bodily difference is something that is very, very important to me. So that was the image that I had of a group of children who were part plant, part human, and how society might treat them. So the first line of the story is, when you grow up, who or what do you want to be? And I wanted the first line to be a rhetorical question to the reader, inviting them into the piece, reaching out and asking them a question. And there is a play there saying who or what, because when we go into this story we see these people who are part plant, part human, who are seen as not humans. So who or what do you want to be? Also this idea of growing up plays into that image of plant that we get later, growing, nurturing. We often say to young girls or teenage girls that they are blossoming into becoming a woman, which is quite a strange image when you think about it, and that's something that I also play with later in the piece too. After that first sentence, which is a rhetorical question to the reader, we have a story that is told by Fern to the other people in her group, a story that's also told to the reader. So we have stories within stories, and having Fern, our narrator, as a storyteller is quite fitting. It says, out on the road, Jack came across a man who said he'd buy his cow for a handful of magic beans. 5 to be precise. He said if Jack ran back home and buried them in his garden, a plant would grow there, a plant so tall it would make friends with the sky. So obviously as a reader we know this story. This is Jack and the Beanstalk, and I wanted to begin that sentence out on the road because it mirrors the ending of the story where all of the characters are out on the road, which is not something you would know when you were first reading through, but something you could connect later. It also has a very obscure reference to On the Road by Jack Kerouac, which is probably amusing only me and nobody else. The last sentence of that paragraph is a plant so tall it would make friends with the sky, and I put in make friends with the sky because I wanted to introduce the idea of the personification of plants. Then it goes on, what if Jack took those magic beans and planted them inside himself instead? Again, a rhetorical question to the reader to draw them in. Swallowed them down so they were hidden away inside him, growing, growing, glowing. And I have used glowing here as this image of shining green light, which is something that is repeated later, something that is growing inside you, a little bit like a pregnancy or a secret that you are harboring, a plant that is growing inside of you. And also the growing and glowing is a very near match for a word. There's only one letter that is different, and that plays on the idea of a hiccup in a genetic makeup, which is what these characters have too. They are supposed to be one thing, but because of something that's in their genes, they are actually something else instead. And this idea of playing with language as genetics is something that I explore in imagery further on in the piece as well. So after we finish that story, I wanted to set the scene for the reader by having that story at the beginning, drawing them in with rhetorical questions, and then I introduce them to the characters of the piece. And we open with Poppy. All of the characters in this story have names of plants, playing with the idea that they are part plant themselves. So Poppy lies down and covers herself in green leaves, so she is camouflaging herself. Am I alive or am I dead? She giggles, trying not to move her mouth. You're both, I say. So both alive and dead, both plant and human. I wanted to introduce this idea of duality. Then it says, she writhes on the ground like an animated rag doll, a sea of aquamarine. I wanted to paint nice images. I like painting nice images with words. I am first and foremost someone who writes poetry, so I have to get these little things in there. But I chose those specific images, an animated rag doll, because the people who run this summer camp ultimately don't see her as human. They see her as a thing. And also a sea of aquamarine, because all the children in this camp are seen as fluid, because they're neither one thing nor another. The next person that we are introduced to is Ivy. It says, Ivy's lounging in the treehouse wearing glasses shaped like clouds. Now, Ivy's doing this because she's extra and she's a little bit out there, but also I wanted her to always mimic the plant that is part of her. She's really tall. She has these long limbs that stretch out and dangle down. So she's hanging and lounging on this treehouse. I imagine her just lying on her back with her arms falling down the sides to mimic the ivy that is in her genetic makeup. And then under that it says, Madam Honey wanders between the tents covered in bees. So I wanted Madam Honey to be this kind of obscure character that we're not really sure about. We don't know whose side she's really on. We don't learn much about her. We have this vivid imagery of her walking around covered in bees, which would imply when we get to know the children that she is like them, that she is different. When we think of Madam Honey, we're also possibly drawn in our mind to Miss Honey from Matilda, who was a really lovely teacher, but I've called her Madam Honey here because of the freak show, and Madam Howard and women who were often called Madam if they were performing, if they were put on for people to look at. Honey is also, of course, something that is sweet, so Madam Honey here comes across as deceptively sweet because of her name, and she is going around the children measuring them. Of course, in life we measure children all the time. We might put them up against the doorframe, mark where they are 1 year, see how much they've grown. But in this instance, she is measuring shoots growing out from the children's chests. So at this point, I wanted to introduce to the reader the idea that these children are part plant. And it's quite a calm environment. Clover is photosynthesizing in the sun, just allowing Madam Honey to measure her. So this is an everyday occurrence for them. So I wanted it to have that sense of calm, but also with a troubling element in the background that would grow and grow throughout the story. So Madam Honey is measuring the shoots growing out of Clover's chest, and going back to the idea of women blossoming, children blossoming into women, the fact that she is measuring her chest is a little bit strange. And when I put in that element of strangeness to make the reader feel a little bit uncomfortable, I then wanted to pull out again. So all through this piece, I'm trying to work out where the level of tension should be and making a reader hopefully feel uneasy and then making them feel okay again, so that they feel confused in the same way that these children feel confused. These children sometimes feel safe and sometimes feel exploited. So as soon as I've inserted that bit of danger, I wanted to pull it back to a joke where the narrator says, "I count seeds in the palm of my hand, 1, 2, tree." After having this short scene, I wanted to zoom out and present the reader with the rest of the characters that we're going to encounter. So we have a bit of a list of who they are and what they look like. Heath here, I'm playing with gender. With Jasmine, I'm playing with society's expectation of race. So she has green skin and she has plastered her face with white foundation out in the real world because she thinks that that's what she should look like. A little bit of a subtle dig there also to Disney's whitewashing of characters. This is Jasmine. This is the voice actress who plays Jasmine. Yeah. I have Daisy as Daisy wouldn't stop talking until the sun went down, playing with the idea that flowers go to sleep at night. But also I imagine daisies, these little cheerful flowers, as flowers that just don't stop talking in human form. That was the image that I had in my head. Maybe that is the fault of Lewis Carroll, I'm not really sure. After that it says, "And the young nocturnal ones sleepily chase their shadows around the lawn," which is a little reference to Peter Pan, and also a reference to children not going to sleep at night and keeping their parents up. At this point, I wanted to ground the reader and show them that this is a summer camp, so that they can clearly picture everything that's going on. So I've been showing little fragments of things and now I'm bringing it together so that they can picture the scene. "Welcome to this year's camp. Madam Honey's smile was sickly sweet. My, how big you've grown." Of course, we've seen her measuring people, but my, how big you've grown is a reference to Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. So the reader is invited to not treat Madam Honey as a friendly person. At this point, the characters come together and they tell stories to each other. They tell each other what they've been up to since last summer, since they last saw each other, because of course they only come once a year to this summer camp. To light the fire that they're all sitting around, they collect dead wood, and when you reread that, you could see that as a very sinister thing, given that they are part plant. And I wanted them to be sitting around a fire because that's how fairy tales were shared. Stories were shared around campfires, etc., when the sun went down. And I really wanted to explore this idea of these characters trying to find themselves in stories and narratives. As readers, we always try and find ourselves in stories in some form. And when you're part of a minority group, you often don't see yourself in fiction and you desperately want to. Stories are also an excellent way to explain the world around us, which is why fairy tales exist. So I wanted these characters to share stories and look to Fern, who is the narrator, to give them evidence of their own existence, to make them feel better about themselves. So throughout this whole piece, they refer back to fairy tales that have elements of plants in them, and they twist those stories so that they can be involved. So going back to the beginning where Jack was referred to walking down the road, what if Jack took those magic beans and he planted them inside himself? What if Jack became part plant? What would that fairy tale be like if Jack was someone like them? So they're sitting around this fire and they're telling stories of their springs. Heath says that he's working in a greengrocer's and I wanted him to work there so that he would feel surrounded by plants. And Heath says that he's saving up money because he wants to go and find the umdalaby tree. Now, this tree is something he's read about in folklore. So again, he's read about something and he thinks maybe this is relevant to my existence and he wants to go on this journey of self-discovery. Ivy, who is someone that I pictured as always speaking her mind, is not down with this so much, and there is a point where she says something and it says Ivy snapped. So we have this image of her being quite sharp with him, but also a play on words, her snapping, that could be seen as something quite literal as well. We have Rose, who is hiccuping petals from her throat into the flames because you can burn rose petals for incense, and after she coughs, this smoke appears from the flames in which our narrator can see what Heath is talking about. As I said throughout the piece, I want to have a sense of unease, then of safety, unease, then of safety. So at this point, I introduce an element of danger by talking about the main crux of the plot here, which is that their friend Lily has gone missing, that she didn't get on at their stop. And when they got there to the camp, Madam Honey told them that Lily's parents simply hadn't returned their calls. And that's the only explanation that these children are given, but hopefully from the big bad wolf element before, the reader doesn't trust what Madam Honey is saying. And at this point, all of the children visibly wilted. I wanted to continue using plant imagery to show their movements and their expressions. I then go on to describe Lily, and I wanted to have her as white hair because lilies have white petals, be someone who sang funeral songs because lilies are plants that are associated with death, and to show her as a rebellious character, to enter the possibility that she may have run away instead of simply not coming back to camp. So I wanted to show the reader how she was rebellious by saying that last year when she was there, she ate apple seeds behind the shower block, and she didn't deny it when she was caught. So eating apple seeds is a reference to Eve and the fall of Eve, the fall of man. Eating an apple, it's also a reference to Snow White, which is of course again a reference to Eve, but showing how she wants to learn things, and she doesn't mind rebelling. It also links in with that image of Jack that we had at the beginning of him swallowing seeds. Lily wants to maintain her bodily difference. She wants to be who she is, and she's proud of who she is. And we find out later that the people who run the camp aren't keen on these children remaining as who they are, and they're doing experiments on them to try and work out how they can stop people being this way. Lily is her own person, and she is proud to be who she is, and that's something that may have got her into trouble. So now I've introduced this idea of Lily and how rebellious she was, and previous to that I'd introduced all the other characters. So it's at this point that I wanted to show how Lily interacted with the other characters to bring everything together. So the way that I craft a story is that I see it as having little fragments that I then have to tie together for the reader to kind of hold in their hands. So the next line says, she was obsessed with HTML color codes called hex triplets. So hex triplets are things that you can use in color coding in computers. Every shade of color has a hex code, and I love that name, hex triplets. It makes me think of witches, hexes, and how these children could be seen as performing some kind of witchcraft because they happen to be different. I also like that it's a reclaiming and a renaming, which fits in with this image that I'd introduced before of Adam and Eve, because of course they named everything in the Garden of Eden. So it's like these children are creating their own world in this garden, in this camp that they happen to be in, by naming things according to their colour. They're rebelling against adults who tell them that colours aren't important because they're childish things, but these children revel in the beauty of the world around them, in the colours, in having pride for those colours, and they will not be diminished. Having a code like this also allows them to communicate with each other in a way that the adults can't understand, and suppressed groups that have been locked up, minority groups in history, have often had codes so that they can communicate with each other safely when they are being oppressed by others outside of their own group. Oh, sorry, there's one other thing as well with regard to hex triplets, and I thought it was a fun idea to play with this idea of code, linking it in with genetic code. There's a link there that you could make that these children are playing with genetic code because their genetic makeup is different to other people's around them. As I said at the beginning of this video, I'm not saying that this is how you should read the piece, because these are things that were just going through my head as I wrote it. They're not even necessarily overt things that I put into the piece that I wanted the reader to pick up on, but this is what I was thinking when I was writing it. Imagery and linking things together is something that I completely nerd out about. So it's all of these little things that please me, but aren't necessarily something that a reader needs to pick up on at all. Okay, so after this idea of hex triplets and renaming, of bringing those characters together with Lily and showing how they used to interact, I have the characters trying to find Lily. It says, we look for her in the undergrowth and down by the stream. We scan the newspapers that she used to love in case she somehow made the headlines. So yes, they're searching for her and they're trying to find her, looking in all the damp places where, you know, plants might grow. But there's also a sinister ness to that as well, because they're looking in all the places that maybe a dead body would be discovered or a dead body would be talked about in the headlines of a newspaper. I I then wanted to insert an image of them pressing flowers between the pages of a book, again showing how this is something that people do in general, pressing dried flowers between the pages of a book, but how you could take that literally, that they are trying to press themselves between the pages of story and ingrain themselves into narratives because they're normally not included in the stories that they read. I then refer to instances of when they have found themselves in newspapers where people have found plants growing inside them. And for anyone wondering, the things that I reference in this, those newspaper articles, they're all true. They are about people who found plants growing inside them. Fern then goes on to tell us about instances of plants in folklore, again, research that she has done to try and find herself in stories. And I ended this bit by saying, you have to find us between the lines, how strange they think we are. And I deliberately left a gap between those two lines. You have to find us between the lines, as if they are sitting invisible between those two lines of text because they haven't been spoken about. But also you have to find us between the lines, you have to find us between the pages, you have to find us in the gaps where we've inserted ourselves. After having that element of danger, I want to rein it back to feeling safe again. And so I have Madam Honey making all of the children draw. And I had them drawing and being asked to draw things because I thought the scientists might be asking these children who they see as other to draw something so that they can try and understand the way that they're thinking, because adults sometimes do that with children. But I also had this scene because I was thinking of Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I don't want to spoil in case you haven't read, but has a similar element. Children are asked to draw things so that adults can see into their soul. And if you've read Never Let Me Go, you will see how that scene fits into this. Again, it's not an overt thing, but it's just something that was going through my head as I was writing this particular scene. And Madam Honey says that they're not allowed to confer before they draw, so she's trying to, divide and rule. And then I have a list of the things that they've drawn so that you could almost imagine them slamming the pieces of paper down, one on top of another. So we pick up some colours and we all draw Lily. Sleeping Lily, dancing Lily, shouting Lily, tiger Lily, Lily climbing up a beanstalk, her hair blending with the clouds, Lily locked up in a tower, Lily talking with the trees. So Tiger Lily is a reference to Peter Pan. Lily climbing up a beanstalk is a reference to Jack and the Beanstalk, which is the tale that runs throughout. Lily locked up in a tower is a reference to Rapunzel, which is a tale that I get to later on in the story. Lily talking with the trees, so showing how Lily can communicate with plants, which leads into the next paragraph, which says, Lily once told me that trees communicate underground, which is again talking about communication and codes, that there are lots of different languages that we simply don't understand, and how we can make someone or a group of people feel other because we don't understand what they're saying, but that doesn't mean that it is any different to the way that we happen to communicate with each other. To continue this idea of communicating, I wanted to then take the reader back into an element of storytelling, which is of course a way to communicate. So come on, Fern, Jasmine nudges me. You're the storyteller. Where do you think Lily is? And then Fern goes on to tell them the story of Rapunzel, about a girl who was stolen, like she's worried Lily might be stolen. But in this instance, Rapunzel grows up to be someone who is part girl, part plant. Her hair grew long like vine and she braided it with bracken. She hung it out of high windows for everyone to see. Her genes mixed with the flowers her mother had consumed. Part girl, part plant, raised up above the world. So Fern has changed this story to insert Lily into it. And then we have Poppy, who is an innocent character, asking if Fern really thinks that Lily has been taken by a fairy. Poppy was the character at the beginning who was covering herself in leaves, so I had her as quite a childish character throughout. I wanted to make sure that the characters, even though they're briefly mentioned, have similar traits so that they ring true. So Ivy, who we have been introduced to before as someone who tells it like it is, again tells it like it is at this point and says that she doesn't think that Lily has been stolen by a fairy, no, but she thinks that she's been stolen by the government and has been taken away somewhere for experiments. Up until this point, I've had the reader, as I said, dancing between feeling safe and feeling uneasy, trying to guess which way this story is going to go. But with Ivy introducing that element, that thought that maybe Lily has been stolen and taken away by the government to be experimented on, I used that as a jumping off point to allow all of the characters to show everything horrible that's going on in the camp. It's almost like They're no longer going to dance around all the things they didn't want to talk about. Now that's been mentioned, the lid can come off the box and the reader truly sees this camp for how it is. Of course, I had to get a pun in somewhere. Lily was not a wallflower. That was a pun that just had to be in there. So at the end of each summer, when the first leaves would fall and they'd come at us with pliers for cuttings, Lily never went quietly. "It's not okay, Fern," she yelled as they grabbed her by the wrists. "It's not okay for them to do this. It's not okay. It's not okay. It's not okay." Repeating things in threes is really powerful. It's used in rhetoric and political speeches. It's also used in fairy tales, which is why I wanted her to repeat that 3 times. But we have now these horrible images of pliers for cuttings. We now know these children are half plant, half human. What cuttings are going to be done? I hope at this point the reader is starting to feel really quite not okay. So we move into the explanation. The first few weeks at camp are always the easiest. We catch up, we let them measure us, we accept the miracle grow and drink as much water as they put in front of us, and we let ourselves blossom in the sun. So a recap of essentially what we've seen so far. Here we don't have to hide. No one's pointing at us in the street, no one's refusing to serve us at the supermarket. Here our differences can be prized, noticed, and admired. So I wanted to give the reader an idea of why these children might actually in some form like this summer camp that appears to be so horrible. And the silver lining is that here they're all like each other and they're not judged for their physical differences as they are out in the real world the rest of the year. I then go on to describe what all of the characters' physical differences are. So Heath, who embraces his pale pink flowers, they go by the name of Erica. He calls them the other half of his soul, and Heath does have flowers on it called Erica. So playing there with binary and with gender and gender expectations. But now the summer is ending, so drawing a cloud over all the happy things that they have experienced, and the September wind is here. Pathetic fallacy. The characters talk about how Lily was an advocate for who they are, for being proud of who they are, and maybe they themselves should break free of where they happen to be and go out into the world and be proud of who they are as well. Perhaps they should take some plant seeds, perhaps they should swallow them. I then included a set of instructions called How to Cut a Rose for Winter, to show what horrible things are awaiting these children if they stay in this camp. And if you read these instructions, which are just everyday instructions in a gardening manual for actual rose plants, it's fine. But if you read them now knowing that these children are half plant and that these scientists who run the camp like to take cuttings from them, it has this whole other horrible uneasiness to it. So how to cut a rose for winter. 1. Begin pruning from the base. 2. Always prune dead wood back to healthy tissue. And as I said, dead wood was something I mentioned at the beginning, which upon reread is not so friendly. 3. Remove any weak branches. It's like eugenics. 4. Roses have a habit of spreading, of breeding. Keep them under control. 5. Cuts must be clean, so keep your secateurs sharp. At this point, I'm hoping that the reader is really rallying behind these characters and wanting them to escape from this awful fate that is awaiting them, and is also hoping, like they are, that Lily has run away somewhere and that she is out there in the world and surviving. So, I have tree surgeons, because I couldn't not have that wordplay come in, and they take cuttings and they have feeding tubes and weed killers, and all the children decide that they're going to break free at this point. And I had them running into the labs and breaking all of the glass and stealing all of the saplings that over the years have been cut away from parts of their bodies. I was thinking at this point of biology classes at school and fetuses that are in jars. And freak shows again. I also remember watching a television show when I was younger which talked about children as mutants who were born with genetic differences and bodily differences who hadn't survived, and that they were kept in these jars and preserved for people to come and just stare at them. And that word mutant stuck with me so much. It made me feel like an alien as someone with a bodily difference, a disfigurement myself. So these characters are going in and reclaiming their bodies. They are taking them back and they're going out into the world. They steal a van and they get out onto the road like Jack and the Beanstalk and Jack Kerouac, and they go out to plant themselves, to breed, to spread the word about who they are and how they're proud to be who they are. While they're sitting in the van, they're holding these body parts of theirs that they have rescued from this lab, and it says that their arms are filled with green light, which again mirrors the beginning of the piece, with that image of glowing, of something glowing inside of you. I then wanted to play with the idea of Lily being like Lilith, who was supposed to be Adam's first wife before Eve, and Lilith is a character in mythology that appears in different texts, and she's always a night spirit who doesn't do what men wanted to do, and she doesn't look the way that men wanted to look, so she went away into the dark and she bred children. And I wanted to have this image that these children from the camp were somehow the descendants of this mythical person. Not really in a literal way, but again as if these children are trying to find their inheritance in stories, their history in stories. Towards the end of the story, while they're swallowing down seeds, I repeated the story at the beginning of the book. Out on the road, Jack came across a man, because fairy tales, when they were told orally, and they had that repetitive element so that you would remember them. And also, it's like they're telling themselves this story again, but in this case, they are rewriting that ending, which is why I wanted to have it repeated here, and I wanted to have that symmetry too in the story overall. I wanted to end with a scene where they reach out to Lily by putting an advert in the newspaper, hoping that she might see it. One, because she loves newspapers and she always tried to find herself in a newspaper, not her actual self, but other people like her, people who were part plant in newspapers. She always dreamed of seeing her name in print in a story, so they end by putting her name in print in a story. And I didn't want them to just write something that anyone could understand. I wanted them to use the hex triplets that they had learned, to use their own language to communicate in a form of code. So they decided to just list Lily's favourite colours as a way to reach out for her. I wanted to end on that letter so that the reader could pause there, almost like they're witnessing this message out to Lily, as if the story is inviting them to help find Lily too. So it says, Lily, we love you. We hope that you are thriving. And I use the word thriving because thriving often refers to plants as well. And then a list of her favourite colours in code: plum pie, zombie green, yellow bee, purple monster. And again, I wanted to end on her favourite colours because they're important to these characters, but because those colours are also the title of the piece: plum pie, zombie green, yellow bee, purple monster, which when the reader started reading the story, they wouldn't understand. They would look at that title and not know what those things were. But now that they've read through the story and they've come to understand these characters and what this code means, they can feel like they are together with these characters, that they understand their language, that they have somehow become part of their story. So that is why I wanted to end on that note, but also have it as the title of the piece, linking in with that mirroring imagery that I had with the Jack and the Beanstalk element as well. So I think this video is going to be very, 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 very long. Sorry. If you've made it to this point, well done. I hope that you don't think that my brain is a mess, but those are the things that I think about when I'm crafting a story. Those are things that I think about when it comes to structure and imagery and metaphor, extended metaphor, thinking of magical realism as a way to represent our world. I would love to have a chat with you about your writing process, how you write, if you write short stories. I also run writing courses if that happens to be of interest. I teach writing, and details are all on my website. All the courses are online, so you can take them wherever you happen to be in the world. If you would like to read more from me, it would mean the world if you picked up a copy of this collection, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night. If you're in the UK, Australia and New Zealand, you can find it at your local bookshop. If you're further afield, you can purchase with free international shipping on the Book Depository, and I also ship signed copies worldwide from my website too. I hope this was interesting. I'll speak to you guys in the comments section. I hope you're having a great week. Lots of bookish love. Bye.